A key concern running through almost all sociological thinking is inequality. The concept of inequality drives many people's interest in sociology. There are others, but the concern with inequality is central to the sociological imagination. A core conceptual normative project in sociology is trying to dismantle the idea that we're all the same, that we can talk about people living in a particular country as if everyone in that country is pretty well similar to each other, Australians, Americans, Brazilians, and so on. Most sociologists want to go the other way and say, no, there are enormous differences in different categories of people in the way they experience the world, even if they're in the same country. There are huge differences between men and women, there are huge differences between different class groups, there are enormous differences between different ethnic and cultural groups. It's important to include an understanding of those differences in the way you think about any kind of social, political or economic issue. So introducing a sociological perspective is very often largely about that, about pointing to the uneven, unequal relationships between people in any given society. One of the issues sociologists are especially interested in then is the distribution of wealth and income. In that respect, we're not alone. Economists think about that as well. But in a way, the economists that do have an interest in this issue are actually thinking along sociological lines. They're working on the boundary between these two disciplines, between sociology and economics. Here is a graph of how the share of society's wealth held by the top 1% has changed over time from 1915 to 2012. You can see a very clear line of development from the early 20th century to today. We've moved from a very unequal type of social structure where there was a very wealthy, very small upper class and the rest of society which was relatively poor, through the Second World War to an arrangement where the relationships were more equal. There was an equalisation of those relationships between these different groups. Since the late 1970s, early 1980s though, there's been a gradual return to more or less the same kind of economic relationships between the wealthy and the rest of us as we had in the early 20th century. Most of you will have heard references to the concept of the 1% in various contexts, and it's been observed that today the top 1% globally own as much as the rest of the world, the other 99%, which has all sorts of implications for the way in which society operates and the way in which relationships between people are organised. These implications raise associated problems, and this is what sociologists are interested in. The first step is simply to understand it, analyse it, work out how it's happened, but the next step is to work out what impact it has on all sorts of issues, the provision of education, health, the way in which cities are organised, tourism and its impact, the way people travel, migration patterns, and so on. The point of looking at issues like this is that they can often explain what is happening underneath, so to speak, other aspects of society. For example, recently there have been observations about the way in which parents are tending to send their children far more frequently to private schools than to public schools. So the number of students at public schools is gradually declining and the numbers of private schools are gradually increasing. Now that's usually presented as a choice that middle-class parents are making based on some sort of values that they hold about public versus private schooling. There's a sense in which that's a choice they're making, they're existing more or less in a vacuum in structural terms, that it's all about a certain culture surrounding how people think about school and the best thing to do for their children, that it's all about values, norms, beliefs, that kind of thing. But when you think about the implications of the analysis of wealth and income, of one group becoming gradually poorer in relation to the other groups, you start to get a sense of what is actually going on in that development around schooling. A lot of commentators have talked about how the middle class is shrinking or subject to a variety of pressures and attacks, having to work a lot harder to sustain its position precisely as a middle class. Many sociologists will say about class relationships that what people are most concerned about throughout their lifetimes is going backwards, some sort of decline in their position and status in society, that their children might be less well off than they are. Every parent has that ambition for their children, that they will be more successful, more wealthy, and that things will always get better, not worse. What's become clear in the last 20 years is that it's possible that that's no longer the case, that it will be possible for the current generation to be worse off than their parents, and that makes parents, not to mention the children themselves, anxious. What you see here in effect in relation to schooling is anxiety. You see a whole part of society that has good reason to be concerned about its own future and the future of its children and grandchildren. That's why there's a sense that in order to win out in that competitive struggle, one needs to turn to whatever strategy is available in order to improve your competitive chances. Competition is a concept that defines much of the nature of the society we live in at the moment. Basically, many parents have come to the view that it's highly likely that their children will have a better competitive advantage if they go to a private school than if they go to a public school. The point about looking at figures like these on wealth and inequality is that they often tell you a lot about a range of other issues that at first glance might not seem all that connected. An important element of what we're trying to teach you in sociology then is how to make connections, to be able to see how the arguments and information and data that are gathered in one context have implications for other kinds of arguments and issues. In summary, I talked first about how a core conceptual concern in sociology is inequality, working out the ways in which people's lives are structured in very different ways, identifying what the distribution of wealth and income is, how it's changed over time, what its impact is, and how it can be explained. The connections between inequality and other apparently unrelated aspects of society is, secondly, an important sociological topic. Third, the example was given of explaining why parents seem increasingly to be preferring private schools for their children instead of public schools, and how this can be explained in terms of the social anxiety produced by increasing inequality. Fourth, it's important in sociology to be able to make the connections between different bodies of information to see how any one aspect of society can be explained by looking at a range of other aspects.